Greetings, students, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Zoller's Social Studies Podcast. Now, on today's edition, we're going to be talking about the Dark Ages in European history. But if you're going to talk about the Dark Ages, you can't do it unless you go back on the timeline to the time of the Roman Empire. Now, if you've studied the Roman Empire before, then you're familiar not only with the military achievements of the Roman army, but also with the cultural achievements that occurred during the time period of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire itself stretched around the Mediterranean Sea, and it included territory in the modern-day countries of Spain, France, England, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and into regions like the Middle East, as well as in North Africa. But the Roman Empire cannot last forever, and eventually it gets overrun by invading outsiders. In fact, the city of Rome itself is sacked in the year 455. And it's this time period, the time period that begins with the fall of the Roman Empire, that historians refer to as the Dark Ages. Now, that leads to a question. Why? Why do you suppose historians refer to this time period as the Dark Ages? Well, let's dispel some ideas right now. It was not a time period where the sun was getting dimmer or anything like that. That's an incorrect answer. So then why do historians refer to this time period as the Dark Ages? Well, let's see if you can help me brainstorm some ideas. Here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like for you to pause this video while you think about some reasons why historians might have called this time period the Dark Ages. When you've got some ideas, unpause the video and we'll go on. And we are back. All right, let's see what you were able to come up with. The first reason why historians refer to this time period as the Dark Ages is because there were few cultural advances that took place during this time period. If you compare it to, say, the Roman Empire and the great achievements in art, literature, philosophy that we see during this time period, certainly there are fewer advances that we see during the time period of the Dark Ages, and that's largely due to the stability that was provided by the Roman army. With the stability that we see during the time of the Roman Empire, that allowed them to not only create these great cultural works, but also to protect them. We don't see these same trends taking place during the time period of the Dark Ages. There's just too much instability. There's just too much chaos. Now, that's not to say that there are no cultural advances, but what I want you to do is think of it like a faucet. We go from the time period of the Roman Empire when cultural advances are gushing out to, well, we're going to turn the faucet down until it's just a slow drip, drip, drip during the time period of the Dark Ages. That's why we say there are fewer cultural advances. So that's one of the reasons why historians call this time period the Dark Ages. There's one more as well. Not only are there fewer cultural advances, but the other problem that we have is there is less written evidence from this time that has survived to today. Now, why is that? Well, there are a couple different reasons. One is the literacy rate falls during the Dark Ages, meaning there are just fewer people who have the ability to read and write to begin with. But the other problem that we see is that many of the documents that had existed during this time period were destroyed in the chaos that happened during the time period of the Dark Ages. So as a result, there's just less written evidence that historians have to view the Dark Ages from our perspective. It's darker than the time of the Roman Empire. All right, let's do some more comparison here between the Dark Ages and the time period of the Roman Empire. And I want to look at this from a couple different directions. I want to look at it in terms of culture, education, trade, religion, and then finally protection. And we'll walk through these one by one. But let's start out with culture. Now, when we're talking about culture during the time period of the Roman Empire, we know, first of all, that the Romans built great architectural wonders, like, for example, the Colosseum, the Pantheon. There was also a host of poets and philosophers who wrote great works of literature during the time period of the Roman Empire. But During the Dark Ages, we see few cultural advances. So that's certainly a change that we see moving from the time period of the Roman Empire into the Dark Ages. But it doesn't end there. Let's look at the field of education. When we're talking about education, we know that students in the Roman Empire, well, they didn't have public education like we see it today, but they had many more opportunities. There were students who would learn from the great works of Virgil, Ovid, Homer. They learned mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric. During the time of the Dark Ages, though, we see far fewer opportunities available. You either had to be somebody who was very, very wealthy, or you had to be somebody who was associated with the church. Remember, we said earlier, the literacy rate falls. There are fewer people who can read or write during the time of the Dark Ages, and that's because there are less opportunities available for education, and they are available to fewer people. How about trade? Here's another area where we see some differences occurring. During the time period of the Roman Empire, they had built this expansive network of roads that stretched throughout the empire. That made it very easy to bring goods from one region, one part of the empire, and transport them to another part of the empire. It also made it much more likely to see the Romans taking part in some of these larger trade networks, like, for example, the Silk Road that existed in ancient times. It was easier to bring goods in from outside and distribute them throughout the empire. In the Dark Ages, however, we see very little trade, even very little regional trade. Trade is really something that occurs only on a very local level during this time period here. What about, though, religion? Here we'll see a slightly different trend. In Dark Ages Europe, the main religion that we see is Christianity. But if you think back to the Roman Empire, you know that actually by the end of the Roman Empire, the official religion of the Roman Empire was Christianity. It actually is Emperor Constantine, who's depicted here, who makes it legal to practice Christianity in the Roman Empire, and eventually Christianity actually becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. So that's a little bit of a change that we see from some of the other trends. But finally, I want to look at protection. Now let me explain to you what I mean here. Imagine that you are a regular peasant farmer, average person in either the Roman Empire or the Dark Ages. Who do you look to protect your farm? Who do you look to make sure that some invading army doesn't come in and steal all your stuff and burn your house down? Well, if you're living during the time period of the Roman Empire, you would of course look to the powerful Roman army. The Roman army is always expanding the borders of the Roman Empire, and so if you live somewhere in the interior, then you have a reasonable expectation that some foreign invading army isn't going to come in and steal all your stuff. Now maybe the Roman army will, but you at least have some expectation that you're not going to have some outside group that will come in and pillage all of your possessions. But things have changed. The Roman army has disappeared with the fall of the Roman Empire, and so our Dark Ages peasant farmers have to look elsewhere for protection. And they are going to start to look to feudal lords. And that will bring a shift, not only in the way the economy of Europe functions, but also in the way that societies within Europe function. Let's look then at our chart. The first thing I want you to do, before we look at some trends here, is make sure that you have all of this information. So this would be a good time to pause the video. Once you have copied down all of this information, then you may unpause the video and we'll go on. And we are back again. All right, let's look at some trends that exist here. If you look at our chart side by side as we compare the Roman Empire to the Dark Ages, it appears like we have a decline in culture, education, trade, protection. This really is a difficult time period for Europe. The only thing that we really see continuing from the Roman Empire into the Dark Ages is religion. Christianity is really like the one holdover that we see from the Roman Empire. Everything else appears to be in decline. But hang on, we need a little bit of a reality check. is it fair to say that all European societies are going to crumble during the time period of the Dark Ages? We know what the larger trends are here, but is it really reasonable to assume that all European societies are going to fall victim to this? That probably is pretty unreasonable, and I want to give you some examples, some counterexamples, that illustrate that not every society in Europe is falling apart. There are groups like the Vikings, one of the most famous European societies from this time period, who's even lent their name to a NFL franchise. But there are other civilizations as well that are equally important. For example, the Franks led by Charlemagne. Both of these groups serve as counterexamples, serve as, you might say, bright spots in the Dark Ages. Well, that's it for today's edition of Mr. Zoller's Social Studies podcast. I hope you've learned something about the Dark Ages, and keep studying the social studies.